Hey, this is Anney.
And Samantha.
And welcome to Stuff I'll Never Told You, a production of iHeartRadio.
And today we have a very special episode. I know when we have episodes with Bridget, and I feel like this is a hint, we always talk about so many things that we're always like, okay, we have to come back and we have to do an episode on it. Well, today we are keeping our word, and we have actually brought back our fabulous friend. I feel like she is an expert of all things like pop culture. I'm going to put that out there as part of your title, Bridget.
I'll take that.
And we are actually coming on a subject that we were like, yes, we need to talk about it. So first and foremost, welcome, Bridget.
Thank you. I'm so excited to be back. And this was like, the last time I was chatting with you two, we were like, oh, we should talk about this. And
yes.
I'm happy that we are actually doing it. I'm happy that it's actually, here it is. It's happening. We're doing it.
It was too big. We could not do this. And what we are talking about, we're talking about the infamy and overall impact of the legend, we can't deny this, of Hugh Hefner. So before we start, we're going to put this at the very top. Content warning, trigger warning, so many warnings. And I don't even know if I'm going to put all of the things that should be tagged in here. So maybe we'll have to come back, but just be aware. We're going to talk about rape. We're talking about exploitation, death, suicide, murder, grooming, drug use, trafficking, and even human trafficking. So I think there's a lot of big conversations to be had, just, adult topics. So if you're listening to this and you're like, oh, this is a great listen on a commute while I'm going to pick up my kids, and you have your kids in the car, I would probably pause.
I would definitely pause.
Because it's going to be explicit. I do think the lessons that have been left in the aftermath of Hugh Hefner and what he has done should be talked about for generations of many marginalized people. I think it's a big thing. And whether you want to call it a warning label, essentially, like you want to warn others about practices like this, or whether you want to talk about it as a historical context of how it really influenced us, this is a conversation to be had. So Bridget and I have two different perspectives. Right? I think we just talked about this earlier.
Yeah. I mean, I agree that this is not the episode to be in your car with the kids. But what's funny is that, so preparing for this episode was honestly almost like a cathartic, emotional, personal experience, because I don't know about y'all, but I watched the show Girls Next Door on E! About what's going on in the Playboy Mansion when I was in like junior high school. And so what's interesting to me is that show took great pains to make the Playboy lifestyle look kind of like wholesome and squeaky clean and fun for the whole family. So I don't think I was the only junior high or high school girl watching that show as a youth. But now the conversation really kind of looking back and being like, well, what was going on in that house? That conversation is very mature and adult and has very mature themes. But it's so interesting how it was framed as wholesome and squeaky clean then, and now the actual reality is like, oh no, this was not wholesome, nor it could not have been less squeaky clean. And it's interesting going back and looking to see like how big of an impact that had on probably a lot of us.
Right. I agree with you. I will say, and I was going to ask this question to both of y'all, when did you learn about or have your first encounter with Playboy magazine specifically, or Playboy? Did y'all ever have one, or when did you become aware of it?
I have never encountered a Playboy magazine. I think that I was aware of it, surprised to no one, through like pop culture. Of Hugh Hefner's appeared in a bunch of like The Simpsons and things like that. I think that was my knowledge of it, was that I was aware that it was a big thing. There are like multiple instances of movies where women dress up as like Playboy bunnies. I think that was much more my realm of knowing what Playboy and all about Hugh Hefner was. His cameos, his multiple cameos he did in several things. And then, I mean, it was just embedded in so much of our pop culture for a while. So like, I knew about it, but I'd never actually seen a Playboy magazine or anything like that. I just knew it was a big deal.
Right. Yeah. Right. Yeah. I think What about you, Bridget?
Yeah, similarly to Anney, I can't I can't conjure up a memory of me like holding a Playboy magazine or stumbling across a Playboy magazine. But also, I can't think of a time when I was not aware of it in the culture. And I think it is that's such an interesting point, Anney, about the cameos on family-friendly shows and things like that, and the references, how that creates a culture where it's commonplace, where I can't even remember a time where it wasn't something that was on my radar. But yet I have no idea the first time that it actually was on my radar. It was just sort of always there.
Right. Interestingly, like for me, I guess maybe coming from South Korea, like literally being born and raised, I wasn't really aware of all of that. I came into the U.S. and I knew porn existed. Obviously, that was a thing. I knew that there were magazines. And I'm trying to remember when the big lawsuit happened in which they made all of those types of magazines be behind like either dark or black plastic, because it was, I think, in my lifetime. I'm pretty sure it was in my lifetime.
I can confirm that it was, because I have clear memories of going into stores and being like, ooh, what's that magazine?
Right.
Where they were not obscured. So I know it was in our lifetime for sure.
Right. So stuff like that was fairly new. Like at the point, like, oh, okay. But I also do remember, I have a very clear, like, I don't think it was a Playboy magazine. I can't remember because I've now started to use some of like things that I've seen on TV. It's like, was that my memory or is that on TV? But I do have a very clear memory of a friend of mine when I was in, I want to say, the second or third grade, in which her dad had a subscription to the pay-per-view channel of Playboy magazine, like specifically their channel, and like turning it on. Because, you know, when you're at like each other's house, you're doing naughty things. You're like, oh God, look at this. Look at what my dad has. And I was like, officially scared of the man after the fact, actually. But that has a whole different thing of trauma for me. But like it was there. It existed. And I remember being like, wow, people watch this? Because I came from a very like conservative Christian home. So none of that existed in my world. So to go to someone else's house, and by the way, he was a very revered doctor in our town. I don't think I told anybody. I was very good at keeping secrets, apparently. But anyway, that was kind of like my first interaction of what this was. And I was like, oh, and this is when they were, and we're going to talk a little more about all the things that started doing porn, which they always denied was a thing for them. Like that's something that they were like, oh, we're not porn magazine. We are a gentleman's magazine, which, yes, we're going to get into. But that's one of my first memories of like, this is a big deal. And what is this? And the level that they had, especially in a man's world, and my view on the man after seeing that, which is a whole different conversation.
Oh my gosh. I mean, so it's so funny that your first interaction with Playboy was actual like pornography that was like watched on a channel that is like a pornographic channel, because I don't think I could tell you that I understood that Playboy produced pornography until quite a bit later. Like in junior high, I don't know how it was in y'all's school, but like people had the Playboy symbol on their, like girls walked around with the Playboy symbol on their shirt, right? It was a common thing for the white girls to like tan, and then like, I don't know if they were like putting like a cutout.
It was a sticker. Yeah.
It was a
I know what
sticker
you're talking about. Yeah.
to like almost make it look like a tattoo in their skin. And so it was such a big part of the culture, but yet removed from the pornography. Right. And it's so funny that for you, it was like, oh, it was my first interaction with it was like, that's legit. Pornography.
Legit, this is porn.
Those are sex
and you were
organs.
A dirty dude. That's my memory. But yeah, so this is, as we've already said, we are talking about the legacy of Hugh Hefner. When I say legacy, we're putting this in all of its like good and bad. We're not talking about, again, I think before, even the last 10 years, we didn't even talk about him as a bad dude. Essentially, like people really wanted to play out all these things that he did for society and for our culture, and not really talking about what was happening in the depth of it and what he was truly, truly doing. Like this was all so self-serving.
Oh my God. So I know we're going to get to it, and I don't want to derail us, but plus 1,000 to that. And the thing that I want to, like, my opinion on the topic is I think that is very much with intention.
Mhm.
I think that, that's one of the reasons why I'm obsessed with reading the memoirs and listening to podcasts of the women who were part of this orbit is I think from the free speech crusades and racial justice crusades and talking about sexual liberation and feminism to the public PR culture image of like, oh, I'm a nice grandpa in a robe and this is all very squeaky clean and like it's all wholesome. I think all of that was manufactured with intention for us, the public, to not think about Hugh Hefner and his legacy in a way that is, frankly, realistic to what it actually looked like. I think that, and so I don't want to make it seem like he didn't do these things for free speech and racial equality. But when people are talking about like, oh, his complicated legacy, I even think that doesn't get at what we're actually talking about, which is using the dark arts of PR to obscure wrongdoing, some of which is criminal,
Right. And I think we have to put this, I was saying earlier that Bridget and I have kind of a two different perspectives because she has done the intellectual thing and read all the things while I went down the like true crime level of watching The Secrets of Playboy or Secrets of the Mansion on A&E. None of this is a sponsor because I was like, all right, I'm not going to read books, but I'll watch this. But the amount of shock that I had watching this and really like having to cleanse my soul after the fact of like, oh, everything's the worst. So with all of that, he has never been convicted of anything. So we need to go ahead and put this here. When we're talking about this, we have to say that all of this is alleged because nothing has been proved in the court or any way like outside of these people's experiences. So we are doing that. But you also know here that we believe women. End of story. So all of that to say, we're trying to frame it in a way of like, this is what was told in these things, whether it's a memoir, whether it's biographies from whatever, or whether it is this documentary. Yes, at this point, we have to say it's alleged. For the documentary in itself, it was released after his death. And there are a lot of people who were very upset. And they were very upset at the women who are writing these memoirs. There was moments I was screaming at the TV from some of the people defending Hugh Hefner. So I did have moments of me like, you are full of shit.
Oh,
and I really don't like you.
Oh my God. So, like, can we get in? So, like, that is a thing that both from the memoirs and from what I've watched of the doc, like, how many people, many of whom were like on the dole or involved in some way, are like, how dare these women try to tarnish his legacy? Right. And I just want to be like, you would say that. You were being paid. You were part of this. Like, you would say that.
Right. Well, part of this thing was like, Anney, you might not want to watch this. This is super gross.
I did get a text from Samantha that was like, maybe don't do this. So I read about it. I did the in-between of the podcast and the documentary.
She researched in that way. She's like, without having to listen to everything that is happening, according to, because the documentary itself, I have to go ahead and put this in there. For the first like few episodes, I was like, oh, this is interesting because they did it where they like had like playbacks or, reenactments. But then like towards the end of them, they had a journalist who was on Playboy as well come in and do an actual sit down interview with people. So it was very like shocking, like the way they decided to do this. It wasn't like an aftermath thing. She just sat and talked with different people about their different experiences. And it was an interesting dichotomy of how they decided to do that documentary. Just on a like overall review of the documentary, just so for people who are wondering.
I picked up on exactly what you're talking about. There were like some editorial choices that I was like, oh, interesting. Okay, this is how we're doing it. And like it is a little jarring, I guess is how I felt. Yeah.
Yeah. I was like, wait, okay. Okay. But with that, we're gonna do a very brief talk about who he was, who Hugh Hefner was. And he was actually born April 9th, 1926 in Chicago to a very conservative family, which he talked about quite a lot, who had hopes of him being a missionary, which I was like, that sounds about right. He served in the military for a couple of years as a writer of the military newspaper. So He's good at this. Went to school at the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign with a bachelor's in arts and in psychology and creative writing and art. He worked as a copywriter for Esquire, which I was like, but eventually left to start Playboy magazine, which he was going to originally name Stag Party. Which when I hear things like that, when I'm like the original idea, I was like, yeah, that was not going to work.
Yeah, Stag Party, I'm glad he rebranded because Stag Party is just not a good name. It's not a good brand.
That's such a different connotation too. Like Playboy is weird enough, but like Stag Party is like you're excluding women altogether. So what's the point?
Right.
But anyway. And it was published in 1953. And I think we actually had a recent conversation about this, right? When we were talking about the fact that the first cover was featured Marilyn Monroe, who never actually consented or approved of this.
Yes. And I would argue that, like, she was not appropriately compensated. Like, she had done a photo shoot for a calendar company. The person who ran that calendar company was like, oh, nobody will ever see these photos. It's fine. You know, she believed that. Hugh Hefner then bought those images without her consent and put them on the cover of Playboy. And like that became a big part of the Playboy empire. So I would actually argue that the entire legacy has its foundation in trickery, coercion, and economic exploitation of women's sexuality. You know, I don't begrudge anybody who wants to take off their clothes and be photographed for money, but I would argue that Marilyn Monroe was not properly compensated or could not consent to the way that image would go on to be used. This came up in the episode that we did around the Lena image,
right?
Was a Playboy model whose image went on to like really shape the internet. And I think we see this again and again with like the foundation being the exploitation of women.
Right. Yeah, as in fact, in a biography.com article, they talk about how she was given $50 and she did this before all of her fame happened because she needed to do a car payment supposedly. And she was like, all right, as long as it's not going to show my face, it blurs my image out, great. And then this company bought it for $900. And then Hugh Hefner came through and bought the rights with $500 and then used it. And like, there's this whole conversation about the fact that he had never met Marilyn Monroe. As in fact, he alleges, and no one has verified, that he had a phone conversation with her about it. Again, we don't know that for sure. And also, he bought the plot next to her grave.
Yeah.
Because he felt like he had some kind of, I'm going to say ownership of her, but more so in his refrain was like, we have a connection.
Oh, I read a quote of him talking about this, and he was like, this is a paraphrase, but it's something along the lines of like, I can't imagine anything sweeter than spending my eternity resting on top of Marilyn Monroe. Gross. Gross.
I will say I did not look into the fact. Do we know, did he actually do this?
Yes.
The plot thing is real. Yeah, that's been verified.
No, I mean, he's actually buried there.
Yes.
Oh, poor Marilyn Monroe. She's been so taken advantage of, even after death. Come on.
Even in death.
Leave Norma Jean alone. Anyway, okay. But just other like little facts, because I'm not doing a big long thing. Hefner was arrested in 1963 for promoting obscene literature, but the case ended with a hung jury, so nothing happened with that. Hefner eventually gave up the seat as being the face of Playboy to his son, Cooper, in 2012, who, by the way, is very loud about saying none of this is true. All of these allegations are untrue and unfounded. And I believe he has actually 4 children, 2 by his first wife, who he married before Playboy. I believe he married before he went into military. And Cooper wasn't one of those, but his daughter, Christy Hefner, was one of, like, I believe she was some kind of big CEO or key player in the 1990s?
Yes, like she shows up in his, sort of protecting his legacy.
Right. When they originally brought her in, and like many companies today, they were trying to show face as like, see, we're about women. We want to put women in leadership roles. Here's my daughter. Look at her, who shut down many things and made sure women suffered. Allegedly.
I'm
gonna put that in here. And then he died in 2017 at the age of 91. I mean, people celebrate him. And I did find this article, because all of the articles, if you put Playboy now, it's all about these documentaries and memoirs, which I'm kind of glad about. But this was an interesting write-up of Hefner in 2011 while he was still alive in the New York Times by Charles McGrath, titled How Hef Got His Groove Back. Why they gotta steal things? Anyway. It says, Hefner is a little odd, certainly, but not a sleazebag. He has none of Bob Guccione's oiliness or Larry Flint's leering vulgarity. His manner is open and direct, and his language is as clean as a Midwestern Rotarian's. By his own lights, having purged himself of the shame and hypocrisy that is a part of most Americans' sexual baggage, he leads a life that is exceptionally honest and moral. It's also a life that is exceptionally well documented. He has been written about so often and for so long that in interviews now he tends to recycle himself, saying the same things over and over again, not in a bored, rote fashion, but as if they had just occurred to him. He complains a lot about America's puritanical, contradictory attitudes towards sex and likes to say that he is a, quote, one-eyed man in a blind world. He also thinks that most men would kill to be in his place. I feel like the only true line to that is that last line.
I don't even think that's true. Because when you read some of these memoirs, it's like it actually doesn't sound that great for anybody who was in that mansion. It's probably going the best for Hef,
right,
but it doesn't even sound like it's great for him in some regards. And I will say, like, you're so spot on that this is all lies. And having read what some of the women had to say about what it was like to be required to have sex with him nightly.
Right.
He is not someone who sounds like he is free of sexual baggage at all.
Right.
He's not someone who is like sexually free and like a libertine. If you read these accounts of what it was like to have sex with him and be required to do so regularly for your room and board, he sounds like somebody who had quite a few sexual hangups that were playing out in the bedroom. So even that's not true. Even this very carefully manufactured persona of how he was as a lover or as a sexual person is a house of lies.
Right. In that article, they do say, because he talks, this is in the era of The Girls Next Door, and how it really did do a lot. Because I'm with you, Bridget, when you were talking about earlier, I watched this thinking that it was a cute show. It was like, oh, this is like the Real Housewife of so-and-so, like in this time frame, and really set up these three playful girls who all like had different characters to play. And then him in the background as just being that wise old man taking care of his girls. Literally, like that's what it seemed. And they all made sure that it felt like they were all immature and doing things, and he was keeping them in line, or at least keeping them safe.
Right.
But he talks about the fact that what did these girls get out of it? And he says a mentor at one point, a friend, and then just a key to success. So again, but that, of course, plays it back down to the women.
First of all, a mentor, that's so deeply insulting. Right. When you read the way that the women describe their own experiences, that's just not true. You know, keys to success, I guess, is when I was like kind of preparing and thinking about this episode, that's something that I'm really grappling with, and I don't have the answer there. Of like, a lot of these women, their association with Playboy is what gave them public attention and public profiles and platforms. So the question is like, is that success? Is that a successful life? Is that a full life? If these women are happy, more power to them, that's great. But then you read these memoirs and many of them did not sound happy. Many of them did not seem to be happy with what was going on. And the thread that runs from all of the memoirs that I have read is like, I didn't feel like I had a lot of other options. I needed a place to live. I needed money, whatever. And like, I think it comes down to like, what is success as defined by our culture and defined by each and every one of us? Like, I don't know where I sort of stand about like whether or not this was something that was actually good for these women.
Right.
Yeah. And I think that's something, I grapple with a lot too is, you know, for one, that he was not a mentor. I just refuse to believe that. But it's like, I've seen this happen where it's a man who will be like, I can get you to the top, kid, like making you all these promises. Like you will find success with me, and feeling like, okay, this is what I have to do to get success and just the systemic issues with that. But I also think, like, we've been talking about this a lot. We just did an episode about Bumble and what their ad campaign, that was a mess.
The Bumble Fumble?
The Bumble Fumble.
Yes.
And I feel there is this thing that is more nuanced than people are trying to make it, where it's like, oh, you're sexually empowered, you want to do this, right? But it's still men like manipulating women into doing this like thing. And if that's what you want to do, more power to you. But I feel like it's so often presented as, oh, I'm going to empower you so that men can look at you. Yeah.
Totally.
Right. There's a lot of questions of ethics.
Yeah. When I was looking into all of the different things that people say is part of Hugh Hefner's legacy around things like equality and racial equality, like, it's like, oh, he had the first trans playmate in his magazine. He had the first Black playmate, and then a Black woman who was photographed on the cover of Playboy with an afro. And I understand why people are talking about this in the frame of equality. Like, when Hefner died, Caroline Tulakasi said that, you know, she was the first transgender woman in the magazine, and she tweeted, "R.I.P. Hugh Hefner, thank you for allowing me to share my story and for your support and platform that helped my campaign for trans rights and visibility." So I get that, but it makes me a bit sad that the equality that we're talking about is having underrepresented people being served up to be sexually consumed in this way, and that part and parcel of that with Playboy has always been giving the women less economically, right? Like, even that first story that you shared, Sam, about Marilyn Monroe, the person who got the least amount of money in that exchange was Marilyn Monroe. Everybody else was getting more money for her body. And so, yeah, it is complicated in that, is that really equality, you know?
Right. And in the Marilyn Monroe, in that article, the biography.com, she talks about the fact that they've made millions of dollars off of me and I have not seen a cent. Like, she literally talks about the fact that she knows how much money that they have made off of this, and how he really did advertise video, like, first time news that people have talked about, never seen. Like, he made sure to blow this up in a way that it was going to sell and launch him into being a millionaire. But I find it interesting that when we come back, because at the end, I do want to have this conversation, because Playboy, Hugh Hefner, touts this whole ideal of allowing women to be a part of these conversations and being whatever they want to be through this access. And it's all about sexual liberation. And for women as well, we want to give you the freedom to choose and enjoy sex and say that you like sex. But when it comes down to that being the fact that women have to pay in order to be able to say that, but they're not able to say that because they can't say no. Like, there's so many conversations to that. And at what point, in what platform, is there a possibility, is there a true way that women can be sexually liberated, where they have all of the power to have the consent that they deserve and to be able to profit off it if they want to? Like, do they have equality in a field that has been abused and used to abuse women for so long? Like, there's so much like depth to that, because like, we want it to be, and Playboy made money off of that idea.
Right.
So where do we get that?
And I would argue, like, that is a great question and a great conversation to have, but I can't look at the legacy of Playboy and say that they were actually offering women that in a meaningful way, right?
No.
Like, just let's look at some of the things that we know about what went on in the mansion, you know?
Right.
Selling pictures of women that were taken without their consent. In all the memoirs, the women talk about how they did not know, but there was cameras in Hugh Hefner's bedroom. And so in these required nightly orgies, they didn't know that they were being filmed. And if your whole platform is around sexual freedom, sexual liberation, that can't happen if there's also coercion and a lack of informed consent. Those things cannot coexist. And so if you are not getting consent from women, and women are being coerced into things that they don't know that they're doing and certainly are consenting to, there is no sexual liberation. You're selling a lie. And so I'm not going to say that there is not a model where women can truly have like meaningful sexual liberation that also does not involve like coercion or exploitation or something. I'm not going to say that, but I can certainly look at this model and say this wasn't it, you know?
Right. Absolutely. Absolutely. In fact, we're going to talk about the fact that, yes, overall, Hugh Hefner's legacy is a roller coaster and it's doing a steady decline. And I think we're all here for that. From an NPR article by Scott Simon, he writes, Hugh Hefner saw the sexual revolution as a companion to the movements of civil rights and free speech, but this leading figure of the sexual revolution couldn't see the feminist revolution. Hef went from being acclaimed an icon of cool to being denounced an oppressive pig. And he also goes on to say that Hefner's reputation for many of the women in Chicago was actually pretty good for some. He says, when I was growing up in Chicago, the formidable women who were my mother's friends considered Playboy a good place to work for a single woman. Women at the Playboy Club were well paid, got chauffeured home in cabs, and customers, stars, politicians, even it was rumored, spoiled by Middle Eastern princes, were thrown out if they weren't gentlemen. My auntie Abba trained Playboy bunnies. When Gloria Steinem and others said the bunny costume, which wrenched a woman's bodice upwards so her chest resembled ice cream scoops, or Exhibit A in the way Hugh Hefner made women into idealized sex objects, my auntie Abba sniffed and said, well, they wear some pretty ridiculous costumes at the Metropolitan Opera too. So it was interesting. And he is not in favor. Like, he's not talking highly. He's just talking about what he had experienced as a child in Chicago who had connections. And you know what? I will say from the documentary, it starts off that way in this conversation. And of course, when we talk about the Playboy clubs, the legacy of the clubs and the magazines, though they were related, were still two different moneymakers, right? Because I think it's interesting to note that as Hugh Hefner was like, I'm about equal equality, I am about all these things, the ratio of marginalized people in the magazine is very low, like real low, right?
It's real low, and yet he is like, celebrate, like, yes, it's super low, it's super white, super conventional, and it's like, oh, well, he did have a black woman with an afro on the cover,
right?
Like once or twice. Like, it's like, how is it this low, and you're also being like heralded as a paragon of racial equality,
right? I think there's like the level of like how many black women were featured is like single digits. And one of them happened to be LaToya Jackson, who was there as a celebrity, essentially. And the way he showed, I think, some of his diversity is hiring them at clubs, is what it sounds like. So they weren't necessarily featured on the magazines. You weren't good enough for that, but you're good enough to make me money this way.
Oh, yes. That is a tension that still existed and still ran as an undercurrent through a lot of the memoirs that I've read of, like, parts of the Playboy enterprise are these coveted things, like getting a cover, being a playmate. And so it's like, oh, I'm good enough to, like, be at your trashy parties and like make you money in some ways, but in other ways I'm not good enough. Like that dynamic is very much an undercurrent of the Playboy, the Playboy that we were watching like in the Girls Next Door era too.
And you know, we're going to kind of talk about a little bit of what his legacies are and what these contain. And one of the big things that people always spout is about free speech.
Oh, yes. So the free speech thing definitely is a kind of a part of his legacy. And as you mentioned, Sam, like part of it is because as a person who makes and distributes pornography, he had to defend his own work and his own, business from censorship and like government censorship and all of that. Him and his ex-wife established the Hugh M. Hefner First Amendment Award, which is still given out today. Which I find like very funny. It started in 1979 to honor individuals who have made significant contributions in the vital effort to protect and enhance First Amendment rights for Americans. According to the BBC, in 1954, he won a legal battle against the United States Postal Service when the Postmaster General Arthur Summerfield refused to deliver copies of Playboy on the grounds that it was obscene. Hefner told the court, "We don't think Postmaster Summerfield has any business editing magazines. We think he should stick to delivering the mail." And Playboy actually won that case.
Right. And didn't he had again, we talked about the fact that the Meese Act, which happened, and one of the big whistleblowers is one of the people in the documentary. And she was a higher up. She was an original Playboy bunny. She was on the centerfold. She was the first Latina Playboy bunny to be featured, and then she just like went up the ranks in the corporation, really thinking she was going to be doing something. Like she was so excited that she was a part of something that she can really work for women's rights. But at one point, she finally had enough after so much abuse. I believe the murder of one of the Playboy Playmates of the Year, I believe. She kind of just had enough, and she couldn't figure out how to help the bunnies, as you said, or the models. And so she came out as a whistleblower, testifying in front of the court about the acts that were happening under the Playboy executives, and that Hugh Hefner was very aware. And this included things that didn't necessarily happen in the mansion, but happened under their watch, whether it was at these clubs or whether it was at these, like they had like lodges, which I was like, oh, I didn't know that existed. Or they had like incidents where they were sending models out and it wasn't actually for a modeling job. It's literally trafficking them out.
Totally. So this is something that I want to like be super clear about, which is that people really talk a lot about Hugh Hefner as this champion of free speech, but the women in his orbit tell a very different tale about the actual role of free speech for women in his empire, right? Like, it kind of almost reminds me of Elon Musk, who is like, oh, free speech, unless you're somebody who works for me and the speech that you are talking about is starting a union, right? So Sandra Theodore, a former Hefner girlfriend who has accused Hefner of grooming young women and keeping tapes on them to silence them, said, there is no freedom of speech in the world of Playboy. Playmates have been kept quiet since the beginning, unless you're singing his or Playboy's praises, of course. No way this celebration can go interrupted. It's a farce, she added. This was after Hugh Hefner died, and everybody was rushing to be like, oh, well, he was a real champion of free speech. And yeah, I don't believe that you should be lifting up somebody as a champion of free speech, even if they do have awards, even if they did have to defend themselves, if they are maintaining and benefiting and profiting from an empire that relies on silencing women's speech to do that. Those two things are completely and deeply incompatible to me.
Right. There's the majority of what Playboy was representing was incompatible to just human rights. Let's just be very clear. Like the overall freedoms and like protections of individuals, point blank. So yeah, what I'm talking about is actually the Mies report, which was published in 1986. It was under the Ronald Reagan, which I hate him, I don't love him, but like things did happen. But it was done under his administration. And they went after Playboy, in which I think like 23, several like convenience store chains stopped publishing, and Playboy countersued, saying that they had lost millions of dollars in revenue, and also you're taking away the freedom of speech from retailers as well as individuals who want to purchase these magazines. So many things, and this kind of led way to what I was talking about with the covering up of the magazines. All you can see is the title, and you can't look at it. And I think eventually will lead to like the ratings, the TVMA type of things as well. But this is like something that he went after, and because he did go after this, people are like, yeah, he's definitely championing for our rights, not a capitalist wanting all his money back, because again, it did hurt him pretty badly. But during that time is when we saw one insider come out and talk about why Playboy is not what you think. It's not about this. And these are things about like harassment and doing under duress, talking about, because we're going to talk about this later, like women being drugged, women being pressured, because we know that several of the models talked about the fact that they came in with the strong understanding that all they would do is show their boobies. They would show some breasts, and that's fine. And then eventually being talked into or coerced or told that they would not get this job unless they were fully naked in so many things. And then I know, like, I believe with most of them, they were all filmed. And they were told and promised that none of this would be published. It was just for them. It was just for our works. And everything is, quote unquote, going on the cutting room floor. We just want to do a behind the scenes type of very classy, which I love that's what they tout to. It's like, it's very classy. It's a girl next door type of shoot. So don't worry about it.
Yeah, I mean, it goes back to that manufactured PR crafted image of this being somehow wholesome, as opposed to what it actually is, which is the exploitation of women, both sexually and economically, that is being maintained by surveillance, coercion, lies, and drugs.
Right.
I almost feel like if that was the kind of enterprise that they were running and profiting from, like, okay, well, that's what it is. But I guess where I sort of take issue more broadly is like, why did we all have to believe that it was really wholesome and like good for the women, right? Like, why can't it just be what it is? The bit about where we all come into it of like, oh, we should all be like seeing the behind the scenes and like thinking it's really like actually good for the girls. That's what I kind of take issue with. Or, you know, seeing the way that these women who spoke up about what they saw, like you were just talking about, Sam, like seeing them be silenced and then also having to praise Hugh Hefner as a paragon of free speech, right? Like, that's what I can't abide.
Right. Yeah. And as you were saying, people who were wanted to tell their story were being told, you can't tell this story, and being silenced by Hugh Hefner and his team.
Yeah. Another voice that was in that documentary, Jennifer Saganor, who wrote this tell-all book about her childhood, which she largely spent at the Playboy Mansion in the 90s and 2000s. Her dad was Hefner's live-in doctor, like kind of a doctor. It sounds like kind of a Dr. Feelgood kind of sitch. But she wrote a memoir about the things that she had seen. And about that experience, she wrote, quote, "I was silent when my memoir, Playground, came out. I believe there is truth to the hypocrisy that should be noted by all. The irony of being silenced by the king of the First Amendment demonstrates the true nature of our culture and abuse of power in our society." And her book was all about like really gross things like grooming of underage girls being given drugs, sometimes without their knowledge. Like her memoir alleges behavior that is criminal. And she was silenced by Hugh Hefner when she tried to speak out about this in her book.
Right. Her story alone in the documentary was horrifying. I was very confused from jump. Like, she was there. She's moved into the Playboy Mansion, had her own room at the age of 7. Like, her dad brought her there. She talked about how she would sit in Hugh Hefner's lap during like their game days, and she really saw him as a father figure, really thought he was so amazing. And then at the age of 15, she realized she was kind of infatuated with one of the playmates who happened to be Hugh Hefner's girlfriend at the time. And they started having a relationship. And by the way, this woman was an adult. I believe she was 21. Yes, she was also groomed into that. But they started a sexual relationship. And in that, she alleges that Hugh Hefner tried to get the girlfriend, brought her into his bedroom, and then they started playing about. I apologize. And the girlfriend started crying and ran out. And he allegedly said to her, well, I guess this is not happening now. I can't do this while she's crying. So he was ready to have a sexual relationship. And this was when she was at the age of 17 with someone she considered him being a father figure and his best friend's daughter.
Yeah, there is a lot of blurring, like you were saying earlier that like, oh, what do these girls get out of it? Oh, well, a mentor figure. And it's like, well, if you're having sex with your like, there's a lot of blurring of roles here where can you really have a mentor and be having sex with him? Should you be having sex with somebody that you said that you considered a father figure? And also if you're like not of the age of consent, you obviously shouldn't, like, that's, you know, a different thing. But yeah, it sounds like a lot of what was going on in the house was this kind of real blurring of lines and boundaries and the line of consent and legality, and it kind of being sold back to us as like not this big of a deal, like a fun party environment, as opposed to an environment that is actually really toxic. I'm sorry. It is wild. I mean, I don't want to like cast aspersions. It is wild to me that this guy moved his kid into that house. Right. It is just like, I have to say that.
Like, there's so many things that I was like, confused by this situation. And I know this was like the early like 60s, 70s, 50s. I don't know, like 60s, 70s, I think, actually. That I was like, yo, why would you take part in this and you're okay with bringing your daughter in there. And then also, I don't know if her father knew that situation happened, but like that they didn't remove her from the situation. She remained there until she left, I believe. And when she wrote the book, she had some publicity. And then she was supposed to go do a few more. Apparently, according to her, Hugh Hefner called her and was like, I'm so proud of you for doing this book. Great job. Can you tell me who else you're going to go see? And then when she found out and she told him, he called all of them and they all canceled on her. So like that was essentially like, nah, you're done. This book is over.
Paragon of free speech, everybody. What a champion of a woman's right to express herself.
Right. And the woman that I was talking about earlier was Mickey Garcia. She was the one that really came in the 80s and came in and testified saying, I have notes. And she actually, in the documentary, pulls out boxes of notes and memos and all the things of all the complaints that she was getting from women, all the rape allegations that were happening, all the situations where they were not correctly protected, all of these things, and then all of them being swept under the rug. But she was the one that really came through. It was like, nah, this is bad. Y'all are doing some bad things. And she alleges also that she was told that she was in the rankings for being Playmate of the Year, which the way they pay is like you get a substantial amount. Well, not even substantial. I think during her time, it was $15,000. And that was like, you get $5,000 for the picture and it being published. You get another $5,000 after it's run for a year, and then get another $5,000 like 3 years later. So literally you got $5,000 a year for like the next 4 years, maybe. Like it was an absurd way of holding money over their head for this instead of just being paid up front, which they couldn't say no to that. They were like, oh, at that point, that's a lot of money. Not really in comparison to how often you got that, but...
And what they are making from that. Right. So it's like, when you put it in context, it's really not that much money.
Right. And as well as, so she was told that she was in the running for being Playmate of the Year, which was going to be like at least double, if not more than that. And that was a huge deal and real big deal thing. But she had to go meet up with Hugh Hefner for a personal appointment in order to make that. And when she refused to do so, they didn't say, she was like, the person who was trying to arrange all this, which was a woman, was like, okay, that's on you, you do you. When she announced who the Playmate of the Year was, it definitely wasn't her. And of course, Garcia came back with like, I'm not saying that the other woman did do any of these things and had this personal meeting in a way, whatever, whatnot, but I'm just saying that I was told this is what I would need to do, or it was implied to me that this is what I needed to do to get to this point.
Yeah, it's definitely clear that a lot of the machinations of how this inner world worked is through things being held over women's head, false promises that never come to fruition, really kind of pitting women against each other. Like, it's so diabolical and toxic, the inner machinations of how this whole system sustained itself.
Right. And it was interesting to me, just like the timeline, when you see things progressing and how gross things got and the level of toxicity that remained. And it really was like Mad Men era type of thing, and then the 60s, 70s, but it was also butting heads with the feminist movement at the same time, which is a whole different conversation. And again, with the racial equality movement. So he had so many other things that he could point to. It felt like a distraction of like, I'm so great at this that I can do these things too. Like it seems like that kind of balance. I
mean, again, this is where it gets complicated in that he did have concrete things that you could point to and be like, oh, that was a good way to push the conversation on race forward, right? Like, he published very sort of like, at the time, progressive conversations about race. You know, one of the first ever interviews they ever published was an interview between Alex Haley, who was the author of the book Roots, with the jazz musician Miles Davis. And it's all about, this was in 1962, and it's all about like racial equality and sort of the future of race in America. Martin Luther King's longest print interview appeared in Playboy in January of 1965. Cooper Hefner, Hugh Hefner's son, told The Telegraph that the last article ever written by MLK before his assassination was published by Playboy. He added that a special edition was published in Braille for musician Ray Charles, who was blind. So he also was a big backer of Jesse Jackson's Rainbow Push Coalition, which was like a big racial justice organization back in the 60s. Hefner donated $25,000 as a reward in order to help the comedian Dick Gregory uncover the bodies of slain civil rights activists. So, like, he definitely did these things that pushed the conversation around race forward. I would argue that these things might have been done out of genuine desire to shape conversations about race. But when he died, the way the conversation was about these things makes me also suspect that they were done with intention to make sure that some of his less savory things would be drowned out by these good things that he actually did do.
Right. And that's like, that big part is that he gave like this credence to the magazine in saying it's not just naked women. Look at these articles. Look at this like boundary pushing conversations we're having. We're talking about LGBTQ rights. We're talking about racial equality. We're talking about all these things that you want to hide, but we are for the people. Like, you really...
Yeah, but it's so funny that when you were at your friend's house and watching the Playboy channel, it wasn't like, ooh, we're going to put on the Playboy channel. Ooh, what is this? Alex Haley in conversation with Miles Davis about racial equality. This is bad. Let's watch it.
I mean, it's become a meme. It was like, no, I get Playboy for the articles. Like, that's that like joke that people have about it. Honestly, the first time I realized people, and maybe because I was out of that world, like I was very religious. And so like that was all bad anyway, because it was naked women in general, bad. But like having the first time I think someone talked about the articles was something with George Clooney related. Like he had published something, and I can't even remember, or about some depth of a conversation that seemed really political. And then I think John Mayer wrote an article in there, or was interviewed in there, talking about how he was getting his sobriety and how he had made all these mistakes. Like he was first like slamming the women, and then he came back later with, now I'm sober.
Sounds like John Mayer.
This is very interesting. Very interesting to me that it's like, look at these women naked. The articles, from what I'm hearing, are mostly men.
I don't think you're wrong. I think it's probably right about. That's what I was thinking too. It was like when he talked about giving equal rights, not that it's not because we need more voices, obviously, but it was more Black men doing the investigative reporters when they were talking about it. Also, they did send one, and I think it's that same comedian, to the newly founded American Nazi group, to interview them, who had a gun the entire interview with him to threaten him. I'm like, really? Like, that's what you decided that was really going to be cool?
Yeah, I mean, I do think like we could do a whole a whole conversation on the way that Playboy understands and creates journalism and media, like apart from the pornography. I actually, the only copy of Playboy magazine that I actually have in my house is one from the 70s with an interview with Gore Vidal, the novelist. And so like, they certainly were like publishing, I think, with intention, trying to publish sort of high-minded, serious writing, like Norman Mailer, things like that. I think to, again, like manufacture this idea that if you had a Playboy in your home, you weren't just looking at pictures of breasts or whatever, you were reading like serious men writing about serious topics.
And I think like when we talked about like who he was and the legend that he left behind, and we're probably talking about a lot of big insinuations in this. Like when we talk about any of the good things that he does, there's always a but. Like this conversation cannot have that. So it's like if you looked at our outline, the way we had placed it was like, oh, we're going to try to talk about these things, but then we'll come into the scandal of it all. But then it just kind of all sits in. You can't do that. There's no real way of like, this is what he did and the legacy and like blah, blah, blah. But this is the legacy and this is a part of his legacy. Like the bad is also a part of his legacy, and we have to forget it. Just because it's newly sought out, or at least women have now, or people, marginalized people have finally come about to talk about it, doesn't mean that it wasn't always there. You know what I mean? Like, I think this is a conversation, which, again, this is a side note of the thing that I saw so much of in this documentary, the back and forth, even from the victims themselves and the survivors themselves talking about, I know I should have done all these things. I know I should have gone out. I'm smarter than this. I should have not done this. This is my fault. The many times I heard them say, this is my fault, made me want to throw up, to be honest. Like, I was just like, this is irritating. Even to the point that one of the ones who was Hugh Hefner's friend and work and defends him to this day. Like, she had a group for support for Hugh Hefner on different pages and whatnot. She talked about the fact that not Hugh Hefner, but one of his ringleaders kind of set her up to be raped by one of the photographers that worked close in hand with Hugh Hefner. And she came out getting mad and yelling at that friend and saying, you should never, she had told her, I'm leaving with you, don't leave me here, because she knew something bad would happen, and said, you should never do that to a woman. You never do that to another woman. But previously, if you had a cut to moment in my head in which she had went after Holly, who was one of the girlfriends from The Girl Next Door, probably the lead girlfriend, probably the most famous of the ones, people who know nothing about Hugh Hefner or the Playboy. I knew who she was. Holly Madison had written her memoir. And in the documentary, she's like, how dare she? She was not unhappy. Why would she stay there? Why would she do these things? Why is she's lying now because she's taking his name. She was mad, but she was also the same person who had an experience that just wasn't Hugh Hefner personally related, but losing that connection that there's a reason that culture was okay. There's a reason another woman who worked very closely with Hugh Hefner literally set you up to be raped. And she could not connect that even today. And that's kind of that conversation that it's so jarring to see. And I don't know if she noticed it. I doubt she did. I don't know if she watched the entire thing, but herself, the woman that was on the documentary. But that's the level of conversations that people really, really forget that there's a connection here.
Oh my God, totally. So the way that you clocked that is so insightful. And from listening to a lot of the Girls Next Level podcast and from reading a lot of the memoirs, that I think that is still an undercurrent where I do think a lot of the women who were in this orbit, whether they believe that something coercive happened to them or not, I think a lot of them are still currently doing the work of processing that and contextualizing it. And I think that when you are steeped in this world that is really about putting women against each other, surveillance and exploitation, a lot of the women talk about everybody in their orbit is also kind of vying for their job. And so you don't know who to trust, a lot of surveillance. I think that kind of environment would be tough for anybody. And I really see the ways that even today, I'm not sure that they have truly processed what that has done to them and how that has colored their own internal understanding of what happened. Because I really see a lot of them sort of doing a lot of that work in public. And I think for anybody, that would be really tough.
Right. Absolutely. That what really was the back and forth of them not being able to fully blame the perpetrator and not fully understanding the depth, the things that have gone through. Because, again, this is that same level. And I really want to highlight for conservative people, or at least those who would be very conspiratory people, this is grooming. This is trafficking. If you want to know what we are talking about and what grooming and trafficking truly looks like, this is it. Because these women have been told, and in till today, people still find Playboy as a mecca or the all final realm of being sexy and a professional. You see so many athletes coming into I can be both these things, and these are gonna meld my image into this beautiful way of whatnot. Which we'll come back to the fact that it's taken a long time to get to there, and they want to credit Playboy for this level of acceptance as being a feminine woman, because that's what Playboy touts, as well as an athlete. These things as a way of opening up their image. But what we're looking at here is that young women being told, oh my God, you're so pretty. You're so beautiful. We really want to help you grow your career. We really want to help you do these things. If you want to do these test shoots, we're only going to do things that make you feel comfortable. Oh, you're uncomfortable. Here, let me give you a little bit of vodka here. It'll be good. It'll help you put to ease. We're going to get you here. Look at this picture. Isn't this beautiful of you? Oh my God. We want you to meet somebody. Meet so-and-so. And the love bombing, which one of the older playmates, who she was the star essentially of the first season, Sonia Theodore, who was one of Hef's first girlfriends in the mansion, talked about this level of conversation and grooming and coming into being oh, you're so loved, you're so adored, you're the best thing for me. And everybody talking about how she was so in love with Hef, how Hef was so in love with her. Again, these couple people would be they should have gotten married. He truly loved her. She truly loved him. And all of these things, to the point that her daughter was mad at her mom at first for doing these types of documentaries because she didn't understand the depth of abuse because she was told by her mother that Hef really changed their life, really put them into such a better place, really loved and cared for her. But in her story, she talks about like really like loving him and really wanting to do these things for him and being there for him and experiencing these new things and getting away from her ugly past into all of a sudden being like, oh, I have to recruit other girls to be a part of this. Begging other girls to be a part of this so she didn't have to suffer alone. Like she talks about that to the point that she also talks about like being handed over to his guy friends and her telling him, this hurts me. This dude hurts me. Don't make me do this. And he just laughing at her and moving on. Like stuff like that. Like this is trafficking. This is grooming. Let me show you what this is. And this is happening to what you see as the quintessential, victim, this white woman who has like, but many people went after her saying she chose this life. So like those who spout trafficking is bad, trafficking is awful, we need to stop trafficking, also doesn't believe that this is trafficking.
Oh my God. So you're talking about the experience of his first girlfriend. I have read the memoir of, I guess, like his last girlfriend, the woman who was married to him when he died.
Yes. She just released that.
I recommend it. It was a very good read. I know that when her memoir was released, people in the Playboy orbit were like, oh, she's just lying. Like, she chose this life. But toward the end, I mean, you're talking about trafficking. Toward the end of the book, she describes what it's like to be in the mansion, which it just sounds awful. I want to give some tidbits about it, but it just sounds awful. But when she decides, like, I don't want to do this anymore, I want to leave, the way that she has to get out, because of the way money works within the mansion, the women are given an allowance of $1,000 a week. It's this up ritual where they have to go to Hef and ask for the money. And he's like, well, I guess you've been a good girl. Here you go. And it's $1,000 cash. They're not allowed to really do work to earn money outside of Playboy. Every now and then they can do like appearances or something, but all of that really has to go through Playboy unless they do like a centerfold or an image, and then they get like a little bit of a talent fee. Side note, the women who were on Girls Next Door did not get paid.
Right.
Didn't get paid. The first person to bring up whether like they should be paid was Kendra, and that was after the second season. Hugh Hefner got $400,000 an episode and was barely in the show.
No,
and so like, the only way that these women could really make money was through Playboy. And so Crystal, when she was like, I've had enough of this, she basically started kind of like squirreling away her money and saving it up and like moving her stuff out of the house little by little. And the way that she has to get out is the way that you would have to get out of a situation that you are not really in consensually.
Right.
Before I read her memoir, I was like, oh, it does sound like this is coercive or whatever. She was being low-key kept against her will. When she had finally had enough, at one point she recounts that when she was like, trying to like physically leave, she had to be like, oh, I'm just going to the store to get some tampons. And then she had to like get in her car and like split. And that when they realized that she was trying to leave, Hugh Hefner was like, don't let her leave. And then it occurs to her, she's like, oh, I'm actually genuinely being held against my will a little bit. And so when you use words like trafficking, I think people think that we're using it as a euphemism, but if you are in a living situation that you can only leave via secretly hiding money away and lying about where you're going, and when you try to leave, somebody physically restrains you, you tell me what that sounds like, you know?
Right. But that's the problem is like when we talk about exploitation here, and exploitation, by the way, is a nice word for this. Like, I really wish, like, and we will, I think, actually go deeper into it because, like, again, kidnapping, coercing, trafficking, those were the things that were happening. Rape, sexual assault, drugging, all of these things were happening in this era and in connection to. So I think this is the biggest thing is, like, part of the conversation that people want to have is that it wasn't him. He didn't know what was going on. But this dude was a control freak because the cameras everywhere. In fact, Tony Curtis, who legendary actor, part of that, didn't know and actually came in. And I don't know if he sued him. I think he did sue him to get any video that would have of him. And because he freaked out, did not realize this was happening. Like, so we know those were there. That has been accounted for. That is a fact. every single person that worked there, every single person that went there for a long period of time knew those existed after a certain amount of time. Not at first. It finally came out and people started figuring out, oh, he's keeping tabs, because it was a power play. It was a kink and a power play. And it's interesting that when we talk about the exploitation, because it can range from anything to just using photos of women to make money off of it, to, which is bad enough, to once again sending them to a remote, isolated area to a man who has asked to essentially buy them, which included Trump, by the way, and to use them, allegedly. And to the fact that women not knowing this was happening, so when they got there thinking they're going in for a modeling job, and the story with Trump was she was told that she was going to the Tropicana campaign, was going to be modeling, shows up, and she was like, oh, sitting and talking to him, having dinner with him, doing all those things. And she was like, okay, so when do I start this? And he was like, look, that's not happening. That's not a thing. You're not here for modeling. And she was like, excuse me? And she called somebody and said, I'm not doing this. And she immediately left. She did say nothing happened. But that was the setup. Like she had gotten set up to be a sex thing for Trump against her will. Like being coerced, like hoping that they could just scare her into it. And that happened.
And we have a word for that. Someone who is being coerced against their will into doing sexual activities with somebody that they don't want to do that with. The law has a word for that. It's trafficking. Like that's not like us being hysterical or something. Right. That's the word. And so I feel like when I think it's easy to make it seem like we're like talking about this in a way that is exaggerated, but you tell me what that sounds like.
Right, exactly. And that's exactly the conversation. It's like, y'all never really say it, because I don't really think they mention trafficking in the documentary. And I'm freaking out as a social worker going, that's the epitome. This is what's happening. You have bought yourself a group of women through a promise of fame and money to do your bidding to get power or money from other beings. And they have no control or say, except they are owed this to you in their minds, in the minds of the power to be. That they owe this to you because you're trying to do these things for them, maybe,
right,
if they play the game.
And within the context of the women like Holly, Bridget, Kendra, Crystal, the twins, Christina and Carissa, it's a lot more explicit that this is an exchange of sex for money within the context of like the girls next door ecosystem. Like all of the girls are clear. We are expected to have nightly orgies on film with Hugh, and we are paid $1,000 a week allowance for that, and we get room and board for that. Like that is much more explicit for the women who are living in the house. And it's curious to me how people would then have trouble believing that outside of the house, for the women who were just sort of in the orbit in a peripheral way, how that kind of same dynamic would still be there. This is the drill. Obviously, this is the drill. The women who lived within the house say this is what happened. They had a very clear understanding of this as a kind of job where the thing that they had to do was sexual favors. Why would that not be the case for the women who were just modeling or the women who were peripherally in the Playboy orbit?
Right. So I was saying that I had the names of the girlfriends, and I have to tell you that the title of the article, which is from HollywoodLife.com, puts it Hugh Hefner and the women who loved him. And I think the chunk of them were like, we didn't love him. We were just told that we would get money.
Yeah.
Which I'm like, why would you post it that way then? And I think they actually write that for the twins. Which, by the way, the twins were 19 years old when they were flown there. They had, they had sex before, but they never had sex together. And being with Hugh Hefner was the first time because they were living his fantasy.
Ugh.
So I think we're going to have to turn this into a two-parter. It's clear that we have a lot to say. Surprise, surprise, feminists have a lot to say about Hugh Hefner. So we'll come back with a part 2. But in the meantime, Bridget, where can the good listeners find you?
You can find me at IHateHughHefner.org. Just kidding. You can listen to my podcast, There Are No Girls on the Internet. It's important to deconstruct all of the ways that media and technology has been used to exploit And we do that. And so I'm thankful that you all do that too and gave me the space to really lay that bare when it comes to Playboy and Hugh Hefner.
And listeners, if you would like to contact us, you can. You can email us at stephanie@momstuff@iheartmedia.com. You can find us on Twitter at momstuffpodcast or on Instagram and TikTok at Stuff I Never Told You. We're also on YouTube. We have a TeePublic store. And we have a book you can get wherever you get your books. Thanks as always to our super producer, Christina, our executive producer, Maya, and our contributor, Joey.
Thank you.
And thanks to you for listening. Stuff I Never Told You is a production of iHeartRadio. For more podcasts from iHeartRadio, you can check out the iHeartRadio app, Apple Podcasts, or wherever you listen to your favorite shows.